Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. Lovely. Okay, so for a bit of housekeeping, just before we start, you know how it goes with these sessions. This session is being recorded. It will be uploaded onto YouTube on York St John events page. So if you do choose to participate in the Q&A later, don't worry, I will keep your details anonymous. I won't read out any identifying details, but just to be aware of that. We have BSL from Dave, which I'm very grateful for. We also have captions, which you can enable in the usual way. You can turn these on or off depending on your preference. And to briefly self-describe myself, I am a white female. I've got long brown hair, blue eyes. I'm wearing a pink jumper. I'm in my late 20s, although I still get people asking what GCSEs I'm doing, which says it all, really. And on certain days, my disability is less visible than others. Today is one of those days, although sometimes you might see me pausing or stumbling over my words or having a bit of brain fog. So if that happens, that's what's going on there. So if everybody is ready, I am going to start sharing a little presentation with you and then we'll get on with it, shall we? Okay, fingers crossed you're going to be able to see the presentation on my screen and you're also going to be able to see me still. Don't forget that you can pin Dave if you require BSL. And yes, like I said, I'm here with you today to talk a little bit about working with a chronic illness. Now, this is something that is very topical at the moment. So before I say any other word, I just want to make sure that my position on this is really, really clear. So a lot of the work I do centers around helping people who want to work and who have a chronic illness to have a better experience. And it's clear that the world of work does need to become more inclusive and better able to accommodate these people. There are hundreds and thousands of people in the UK alone who are so talented and have so many skills to offer, and they just don't have the right opportunity to do so yet. But at the same time, there will never be a situation where every single person with a long-term illness will be well enough to work. And forcing people into unsuitable roles just isn't the answer that people seem to think it is. So before I go any further, this information I'm putting out there to help the people who want and are able to find work, rather than arguing that everybody with a chronic illness should be in work, which is categorically not the case. But yes, so I thought I'd get started by telling a little bit about my own story and my own background, because I haven't always been a disabled person. I started acquiring the symptoms of my chronic illness when I was a teenager. Like many people, it took many years and many, many doctor's visits to finally get the right diagnosis. And it took even longer still before I realised that I was quote unquote allowed to identify as a disabled person. But something that I started doing during that time, obviously becoming ill was a really isolating experience and my whole world had to change. I was very lucky and I did manage to just about hang on in there at university. But alongside my studies, when I was able to, I started sharing my story on social media. Not anything too fancy, really. I just started sharing little snippets of what I was going through, how I was feeling. And it was honestly seeing other people on social media who I could relate to and who were going through similar things that really empowered me to start doing the same thing, to start sharing my story and connecting with other people. Writing is something I've always really loved to do. So it felt like quite a natural transition to start sharing my story myself. But back when I started doing that, I had no idea that that was going to form the foundation for the kind of work I do now. It really has been a full circle sort of thing. But like I said, I was at university. I managed to graduate in 2016. And then after that, I was kind of thinking, well, what happens next? There was just a big question mark over the future because I was one of many, many people who fall into this sort of grey area with chronic illness. So I knew that I was well enough to work in some capacity. I wanted to work and I wanted to do something. But at the same time, I knew there was absolutely no way that I was going to be able to work a full-time job, to do regular hours like a 9 till 5. And there was definitely no way that I would be able to commute or to work in a physical workspace. And bear in mind, this was in 2016. It was before any hint of a sort of lockdown. And even finding the opportunity to work from home was like looking for a needle in a haystack. They just didn't seem to exist, let alone accommodate the other adjustments that I knew I would need as well. So it was very, very difficult to find any sort of paid work. And I had to persevere. It took quite a lot and quite a lot of rejections. But eventually, I was very lucky and I did manage to find a 3-month internship in the charity sector. So I started working for a really great disability charity as an intern. I really gave my all to that position, and I was, again, very lucky, and that did change into a permanent role. So I stayed with that charity for 3 years. I was employed by that charity. I learned so many useful skills. But at the same time, I was still sharing my story on social media. I was still doing all of these things. I was starting to get writing opportunities, media opportunities. And the more that that increased, the harder it was to resist the pull of temptation to lean into that stuff. But eventually I realized that I was going to have to start reducing the number of hours that I was doing in employment and increasing the number of hours that I was doing in self-employment. You see a lot of these inspirational narratives about people who quit their job, go cold turkey and throw themselves into their passion. But with a chronic illness, I do think you have to think a little bit more rationally about these things. So making the transition from employed to self-employed was something that I did very slowly and carefully, but I did manage to get to a place where I am now full-time self-employed. I'm a disabled freelancer and I do work that I really, really love. There are lots of different branches to that work. So I am a writer, which is still just the wildest thing, and I'm so grateful for it. I write books. I also take on freelance writing commissions. I'm a columnist for different organizations. I do speaking work. I do content creation stuff on social media. But then the part of my work which really ties into what I'm here to talk about today is I work as a communication consultant in the charity sector. And one of the charities who I work for, who are very, very close to my heart, are called Astriid. Now, Astriid is quite a small charity. It's been going for quite a few years, but we essentially match talented people with long-term health conditions with meaningful work. And we also work directly with employers and organisations who want to evolve their workplace practice to become more inclusive for people with chronic illnesses. And there is that specific focus on chronic illness and long-term health conditions as opposed to disability more broadly, because as we'll go on to talk about today, there are some unique barriers that come with chronic illness that, as of now, aren't often acknowledged in the conversation about disability and employment. And that is something I'm working very hard to change. Now, I've briefly mentioned about my own chronic illness, which is a condition called ME, and I've absolutely no doubt that some of you people who are watching this right now will either have ME or have a very similar condition. And first of all, I wanted to share something which was perhaps a little bit left field in the context of employment, but something that has just helped me immensely, not only in my work, but just in my person and my identity as a disabled person. And that is a term called energy limiting conditions. Now, this term was coined by an organisation called Chronic Illness Inclusion, and their mission was to try and better represent the experiences of people with chronic illness within the social model of disability. So within the social model, we often hear about people who have physical impairments, hearing loss, sight loss, learning difficulties, neurodivergent. But for a long time, there wasn't really the terminology that encapsulated the experiences of people with chronic illness. You'd sometimes find this kind of catch-all category, which I think said stamina, breathing, and fatigue. But again, if you're watching this and you have a chronic illness, you know that words like that still don't really reflect what we go through on a day-by-day basis. And that's why the term energy limiting conditions is so useful in this context. So this is basically an umbrella term, and that covers a lot of different chronic illnesses. So things like ME, fibromyalgia, cancer, autoimmune conditions, neurological conditions. There are so many things, but what all of these conditions have in common is that the people affected by them have a shared experience of key symptoms. One of those things is something called energy impairment. So that is a specific phrase that we can use as an alternative to fatigue or tiredness. And using the term energy impairment helps to differentiate the things that we go through from just the everyday tiredness that a non-disabled person might go through. Again, I'm sure there are other people here who are often told by other people that they get tired all the time as well, which is just not helpful for anybody. People also have a shared experience of chronic pain. something called post-exertional malaise, which is where you might overexert yourself at one point in time, and then later on, the impact of that really hits you and makes all of your symptoms a lot worse. And the other important thing they point out is that people with energy limiting conditions have often faced medical gaslighting. They've often gone to medical professionals to try and get help, only to be told that they don't believe that their condition is real, that it's not serious, that it doesn't affect them as much as people say it does. And obviously that can take a real toll on a person's feelings of self-worth. So it was felt that that was really important to include in this definition as well. Now, sometimes when you talk about energy limiting conditions or chronic illness, people think that you're only talking about a minority of people. But research by Chronic Illness Inclusion estimates that actually up to 1 in 3 disabled people in the UK meets the criteria for having an energy limiting condition. So when we talk about this population, we aren't talking about a tiny minority, we're talking about a huge population. And yet still the unique needs of this population aren't always taken into account in the disability movement. And in the past, I have really felt that profoundly in the context of employment and what we're talking about today. Now, as I mentioned, I work for a small charity called Astriid, and recently, really recently actually, this month, we released a new research report. As I mentioned right at the start, there's a lot of conversations happening at the minute about employment and long-term health conditions. And often the people who have the mic are people who have no experience whatsoever of these things. There's very little research in this area as well. So what we wanted to do with this report is actually hand the mic to the people who are affected by this issue and see what they have to say. And from that research, one of the things we identified was this top 10 health-related barriers to work. So these are the things which people told us are actively preventing them from finding or being in work. The really obvious one is fatigue and limited energy. Another really big one is the fact that people's capacities fluctuate on different days. You have some days that are better than others and others that are a lot more difficult, and often there's no real predictability about it. Cognitive fatigue is also something that people really worry about in employment, things like brain fog, short-term memory issues. The next biggest one was payback, post-exertional malaise, which we touched on earlier. Pain is unfortunately a really common one, dizziness. Sensory sensitivity refers to challenges often found in being in a physical workplace and around other people. It might be noise sensitivity, light sensitivity, which can cause immense difficulties for people. There's also nausea, continence issues, and mental distress is unfortunately a big one as well. The impact of living with a long-term illness in an ableist world can really take a toll on a person's mental well-being as well, and that in itself can become a barrier. So after we identified those barriers, we asked people what they felt would be the things that helped to overcome them if that person wanted and was able to be in work. And the single biggest thing that people told us is that they desperately wanted employers to have a better understanding of long-term conditions. And again, this reflects the fact that the unique needs of people with energy limiting conditions aren't always included in the wider conversation about disability. So, for example, employers might know that they need to put a ramp down and make sure that their physical premises are accessible, but they might not yet understand the importance of flexible working and understanding and the unique symptoms that people experience and the shared experience of gaslighting and all of the stuff like that. Those conversations often lack nuance in the area, and that's something that we're really working to change. The next biggest thing is that people wanted to see job ads that state flexible working provisions right at the very beginning. So when someone clicks onto a job ad, they want to be able to see that flexible working is a possibility for that role before they spend their valuable time and energy going through the whole application process, only to get to a point where they find out that the job they wanted and the job they've been offered isn't going to be accessible for them after all. Health management support in work was a big one. Part-time roles was a big one. There are some people with chronic illness who can work full-time hours, but generally speaking, the majority will need reduced hours. And that's another one of the biggest barriers that people are facing at the minute, and another one of the points of contention in the current commentary on this. So there's never going to be a situation where more people with chronic illnesses can end up in work if there aren't the suitable roles there to apply for in the first place. If we want to see change, then we desperately need more opportunities to work from home, more opportunities with reduced hours. And again, that is something that we're really pushing for. Um, Interestingly, people really felt they would value one-to-one mentoring support from someone who is an expert in long-term conditions, someone who can help to guide them through that process. Peer support was another really big one. People wanted to feel like they had support from the people around them. People wanted help to create a health adjustments passport. Now, if you haven't heard of this before, it's relatively new. It's only come in the last couple of years, but it is useful to know about. So this is basically a free resource that you can download from the government website and anybody can fill it out. And it's essentially a document that you can fill out with comprehensive information about your health condition and how it affects you in work and the kind of adjustments that you would find helpful. And the thought process behind it is that you can carry that document with you anytime that you start a new role or you go into a new opportunity. And that saves you from having to constantly disclose and explain your needs over and over again, which, as we all know, that in itself can be exhausting and sometimes a bit demoralizing as well. Benefits advice around part-time work is huge and so important because that's a very complex area to navigate. People would really value training or reskilling opportunities. Sometimes when someone acquires a chronic illness later in life, they realise that they won't be able to work in the same industry they were in before and they have to train for something new. And also confidence building, whether somebody is new to work or they're returning after a leave of absence, just being able to build your confidence back up can go a really, really long way. And that is something that people told us that they really wanted as well. So that's just given you a whistle-stop tour of the current climate in the UK. So the next thing I want to share is 5 helpful tips for any of you who are watching this right now, either wanting to get into work or thinking about how you can improve your situation. So the number one thing is to think about how you can communicate your reality in a way that's effective. We've talked a bit about the social model of disability. Understanding and awareness of this is increasing among employers, which is really, really great to see. But what you might want to think about in advance is what are the key parts of your experience that are likely to impact you in the job that you're going into. It can be helpful to spend some time making a list because then these things are going to be at the forefront of your mind rather than something that you desperately have to scramble for when you're asked about it in person. Again, joys of brain fog mean I know what it's like when you're put on the spot sometimes and you know the information is in your brain somewhere, but you just can't find it. And it can also be really helpful to think about how you can explain these things you're experiencing in a way that's going to make sense and resonate with a non-disabled person. And that in itself is no small feat. It might be that you use metaphors like the spoon theory. A lot of people say that their body is like a broken battery that never fully charges up. Whatever sort of thing you feel comfortable with, just think about how you might communicate your reality to somebody if you were in a situation where you were put on the spot and you needed to describe it succinctly. The next piece of advice I have is to consider different routes to work. So despite what people might tell you, there is no singular right way to make that transition into work. It's sometimes we're like conditioned to believe that we finish education, we move into work, we stay in the same job and we work our way up the career ladder. When in reality, our working world is more diverse now than it ever was before. And I see that as a really brilliant thing. So it might be that you want to look into internships. If you're just finishing your education, you might want to look into graduate schemes. There are now a lot more graduate schemes that have opportunities that are ring-fenced for disabled candidates. So it is worth exploring that. If perhaps you haven't been in work before, I generally don't like to advocate for unpaid work, but if you're not sure about your capabilities or you're not sure how being in work is going to impact you or impact your condition management, I do think that volunteering as a starting point is a really useful way to test your capabilities and figure out how it affects you, because then at least you're going to be equipped with that knowledge before you start looking for paid roles. In a similar way, apprenticeships are a really great way where you can build up your skills over a slightly longer timescale. It's all about thinking what is going to suit you. So don't worry about doing what everybody else is doing. And please don't try and force your body to do something just because you think it's the right thing to do, because looking after your body and thinking about the longer game is so much more important. And the other big thing that is worth considering is a whole massive topic in itself, but it's employment versus self-employment. As somebody who has experience of both, I cannot sit here and say that there is one that is better than the other when it comes to chronic illness, because Both have pros and cons, and everybody's experiences of chronic illness are so incredibly unique, but it is worth sitting down and spending some time thinking about which one of those would be most suitable for you. This is a biggie. Become familiar with workplace adjustments. Now, a lot of us with chronic illness, like I said at the start, a lot of us often don't feel like we can identify as disabled people. We often don't know if we're quote unquote allowed the same measures that other disabled people experience. But let me tell you right now that you are entitled to workplace adjustments if you have a chronic illness. You can request them when you start a job, but you can also make changes or request them at any time during your working life. It doesn't matter if you're already in a role. If your needs change or you become aware of something that might help you, please don't be afraid to ask for the things you need. So my best advice is to research what kind of workplace adjustments are out there. I do actually have a blog post which shares workplace adjustments for people with ME. If you might find that helpful, I will try and share a link to that at some point, but you can find it on my blog. And also, you're going to see lists that kind of stipulate the same sort of adjustments, but please don't be afraid to ask for the unconventional. If there's something that you feel might actually help you in work, but you haven't seen anybody else ask for it, please don't let that put you off, because anything that can support your well-being in the workplace is 100% worth having. And yes, the last thing I want to say on that is that sometimes people worry that asking for workplace adjustments makes it seem like they're asking for special favours or they're being prioritised other people. But all that workplace adjustments do is put you on a more level playing field with the people around you, and they help you to do your job at less physical and emotional cost to yourself. So please don't think that you're not allowed or that you shouldn't ask for them, because having the right adjustments in place can make such a massive difference when it comes to working over the longer term. It's important to know your rights and know what support is out there, because it does exist. Access to work is a brilliant resource. It's not perfect, it's definitely not perfect, but it's essentially a pot of money that you can claim to help you cover the additional costs that come with working with a disability. It might be that it helps you to fund specialist equipment, a support worker to help you do your work tasks, travel, taxis, public transport. There are so many different things you can claim, and you can also claim this if you're self-employed. You don't just have to be employed. But my best piece of advice is that the waiting lists are very, very long at the minute. I believe they're about 16 weeks long at the minute. So please apply early. And if you have been offered a job but you haven't started yet, you can still apply before you start your job. Health adjustment passports, we talked about these earlier. That's a free document, anybody can fill it out. And like I said, it just saves you from having to disclose your needs constantly and over again. I hope this isn't the case for you, but if you do get to a point where you are experiencing discrimination in the workplace, please know that this isn't something that you have to put up with. There is legal advice out there if you need it. Scope has a really great helpline that's fronted by people with lived experience of disability. And Disability Rights UK is an organisation who shares lots of great information online as well. So it's worth having those on your radar, I would say. And the final point I want to share for now is simply to listen to your gut. There's a lot of information, there's a lot of conversations happening at the minute. Often when you have a chronic illness, you end up with a lot of people trying to tell you that they know what's best for you. But at the end of the day, you know yourself and your body better than anybody else on the planet. You will have an innate understanding of what your body is trying to tell you. All of us sit here, myself included, and there are often times where we know we're overdoing it and we don't always listen to our bodies, because often what our body wants and what our mind wants are very different things. But when you're thinking about work, you really need to be thinking about the longer game as well. So please listen to what your gut is telling you at any given time. If you are new to the world of work, or you've had a leave of absence due to your health and you're now returning to work, the best piece of advice I can give you is, if it's possible, start out small. Do a little bit less than you think you're capable of. If you think you're capable of doing, this is just a very broad example, if you think you're capable of doing 16 hours a week, ask if you can do 10 to start with. Take on fewer things in the beginning, because you can always add stuff in later on. You can always build it up, and it's much easier to build it up than to do too much at the start and try and scale it back again. And I feel like it's important to say, it's a little bit difficult to describe, but when I started work, I found it incredibly difficult at the beginning, but you do start to build up quite a unique stamina for work. Even though I wasn't experiencing an improvement in my chronic illness at the time, I did find that slowly and carefully, I did become more capable of doing my job, and it took less out of me to do my job as the weeks passed by. Now, obviously, that is not an experience that universally applies to everybody. And you do have to make sure that you're not overexerting yourself. You're not booming and busting in the beginning. Otherwise, you won't have that capability to build up. But I just think it's so important to take good care of yourself in the beginning, because, like I said, there is always going to be the opportunity to build up if that's something that you want and you are capable of doing. And the last thing I want to share for now, before I get rid of this presentation, is that although working with a chronic illness is really tough, and often it does feel like your choices are taken away from you, things genuinely are improving. It might not seem like it given the recent media coverage, and it's clear that there is so much work that needs to be done. But from working at Astriid, I can tell you that inclusive opportunities are slowly starting to build up. Employers are slowly starting to genuinely understand more about chronic illness and why it matters to have inclusive roles. And before, we would often only see part-time or inclusive roles in very specific sectors like technology, computer science. But over time, we are starting to see these opportunities spread across lots of different sectors as well. So the point I'm trying to make is that in the past, like I talked about, I felt like I didn't really have choice over what I did with my working life. I was applying for roles and it felt like I had to go with what was possible to do rather than what I actually wanted to do. And although that is still true to an extent, you do have the ability to have a bit more autonomy over it now. And I have every confidence that the ability to do that is only going to increase in the future as well. So I think although it's important to consider what is possible for you from an accessibility and a health perspective, I also don't want you to discount what you really want to do with work, what you want your working life to look like, what your ambitions are, what you're really passionate about, because there will be an opportunity where both things are possible to accommodate. I'm not saying that it'll be easy to find, but it is possible to find it. And when you start to get that balance right, take it from me, it is so worth it. It really, really is. So I am going to open the floor to questions in a minute. I've tried to leave as much time as possible for questions, and I can see a few popping up already. So if you do have questions, there's a little Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to pop them in there. But just to round off this little section, I wanted to say thank you very much for listening so far. I hope you've learned a little bit more about employment and chronic illness, whether that's from the perspective of an organisation or as an individual. On the screen, you can find where you can find me on social media. You've got to get that plug in there. But for now, I am going to get rid of this. I'm going to stop sharing my screen somehow. Lovely. Okay. Okay, so yes, like I said, if you have any questions, feel free. I'm just going to have a glug of water and then we will get started on the questions. Okay, so the charity I mentioned right at the beginning is called Astriid. We are quite a small charity based in the UK, and our mission is to help make the world of work more inclusive for people with chronic illnesses. We do this through different ways. We used to have a candidate support service, which was free for individuals, and we would help people to develop their skills, identify their passions, and help to match them with inclusive roles. Unfortunately, due to budget constraints, we have had to pause that for now. It's a very difficult time for charities. So we've had to wind that down for now. And what we're focusing on at the minute is our consultancy offer for employers. We have lots of different training materials and training packages, and we aim to help employers to better understand the value of hiring people with chronic illnesses and how to make the process of being in work a lot more inclusive and energy friendly for them. So yes, that's the charity Astriid. How do I reference this presentation? I'm not sure. I will find that out. This will be available on YouTube, on York St John's YouTube channel. So if you want to link to it that way, please feel free. Access to work has found me eligible for a job aid. I haven't taken this up because I felt that recruiting and briefing someone on the tasks I'm too brain foggy for would be harder than doing it myself. Do you have any advice for me as a person who needs support with only some aspects of my job? I cannot tell you how much I can relate to this because I've been through the exact same thing. I do have a job aid granted for a set number of hours per week, and I had exactly the same concerns, even just how tolerating the presence of another person might affect me. And it's definitely not easy. And at the end of the day, it is a personal decision whether the benefits of the stuff they're helping you with outweighs the costs of, like you said, having to brief someone, having to be around them, having to exert extra energy on the communication side of things. In terms of advice, I think it's really important to find a person who's the right fit. Again, easier said than done. And I think as well, you've got the funding for it. You can always try it. And if you don't like it, you can end it. So I wouldn't let it put you off getting somebody in. Even if you've got the funding for a certain number of hours, let's say you get 6 hours a week, why don't you try having somebody for 2 hours a week, see how you get on and see whether it's adding value or actually making things more difficult. I think that's my best advice, just to give it a go and see how you do. Similar resources in the US? Not that I know of, but if I find any, I will share them online. It's that thing. There's lots of support services for disability and employment, but chronic illness and employment can be a little bit more challenging to find. Are there any job search websites that list jobs that are 100% work from home? I keep seeing these roles advertised, but then realizing they want you to travel to an office. Yeah, that's not ideal. That's not what you want. I don't know if there are any that 100% guarantee that every opportunity is work from home. I do have some resources that I recommend from personal experience. I don't think I can share links on here because I don't think I have the chat box, but on my blog, which is lifeofpippa.co.uk, there is a blog post called Finding Accessible Work with a Chronic Illness. And on there's a big list of resources, different websites, and some of the ones on there, I would say you are more likely to find work from home opportunities, if not 100% all work from home opportunities. Do you manage to earn a lot of money as a freelancer? Depends on the month. It is so fluctuating. Oh my goodness me. I wish I could say yes. Sometimes you have opportunities that are very lucrative. Sometimes you think, why am I putting all this energy in and only earning pennies? So it is such a variable thing. I am improving year on year. I'm building up slowly. My goal when I became a freelancer was to one day be able to match what I was earning in employment as a freelancer. I'm 4 years in and I'm yet to do that, but I'm hoping that either this year or next year will be the year that I match what I was previously earning. But it's very different for everybody. As well as finding inclusive and supportive employers, what has made the biggest difference to you in developing your career? I think for me, that's a really great question. I think it's learning to look more inwardly, which is a process that I'm still very much working on, but it's been figuring out what works for me as an individual rather than constantly comparing myself with the other people around me. A lot of my friends from uni have had very typical sort of trajectories into work. A lot of them are on grad schemes and they do work in a very different way. And when you're comparing yourself with the people around you, even though their circumstances are very different, you can really beat yourself up because you're not doing the same. I often feel as though, even though I'm giving my all, like what I'm achieving isn't enough or that I'm falling short somehow. So I think just learning to look inwardly and realizing that the path that you're on is very different from the people around you. Although it can be quite a tough realization, it can be quite freeing as well. And like I said, it's definitely a work in progress, but I'm making some progress on that front, luckily. What are your thoughts about managing schooling well, dealing with cognitive fatigue? To be fully transparent with you, although I do have cognitive fatigue, it definitely isn't as bad as other people have it. I know there are people who can rarely get through the fog, whereas I have always had at least some clarity and the ability to focus. Again, I think it's about figuring out what works for you as an individual. pacing was a really big thing, and realizing that pacing my cognitive energy is just as important as pacing my physical energy. So in the past, I would try and sit and stare at a book for hours and then wonder why nothing was going in, when in reality, doing smaller chunks more often, although it can feel frustrating at the time, that can be the most efficient and energy friendly way of doing things over the longer term. But yeah, my heart goes out to anybody who's going through school or higher education while dealing with cognitive fatigue, because it's definitely not easy. Do you have any advice on communicating flares to your employer before they are life-limiting and cause sickness? I've been in my work for a few years and struggled to explain how I am feeling when at the beginning of my role, I was very symptom-free, and needing to start the conversation partway through my employment feels quite difficult or embarrassing. Yeah, that's really tough, and I'm so sorry you're going through that. Let me think. I think, so I have conflicting advice on this one. I have conflicting thoughts on this one. If you are in employment and you're in a long-term role, I can really see the value in having regular check-ins with an employer, or even if it's not your employer, having regular check-ins with somebody who you work with. And that's a really effective way, not just of checking in terms of job tasks, but also just checking in on how you are as a person, how you're doing, how things are for you. But then at the same time, I know how frustrating it is when you work reduced hours and you feel like a lot of them are taken up in meetings, which can be quite energy draining. I think if it feels possible to you, I would encourage you to have some sort of regular communication to see if you can set that up with somebody, whether it's an employer or HR or somebody you trust. And even if that's emailing rather than having like a face-to-face meeting or talking on the phone, just having something in place where you say, can we just check in at this time in the month, just so I can let you know how I'm feeling, how things are going. But I appreciate that's a really difficult thing, because as you say, you never know when a flare is going to come up, and trying to be proactive in that is really, really tough, but it is important. So I hope that's something you can consider. Thank you very much to the person who shared a link to Astriid. That's great. Which YouTube channel this will be on? It will be on York St John events, YSJU events on YouTube. I believe it will be up in a few days' time. If you follow me on social media, I will share a link when it's up. May I use your slide on symptoms? I will try and figure out how to make this slideshow public. It isn't something I've got a lot of experience on, but if you feel it will be helpful, I will try and figure out how to do that. Do you have any advice for someone considering stopping work completely? Even on an inclusive team, my health is declining and I've run out of ideas to make it work. I'm so sorry to hear that. That's not an easy realization to have at all. If you've even had that thought enter your head, my best advice would be to listen to your gut and take that step back. I appreciate that can feel like a really scary thing, but it sounds like you've given a lot of thought to it already. And if there is no way that you can make this work, then please don't feel like you need to keep going. Take a step back, give your body and mind the space that it clearly needs, and who knows what the future holds. But if there's anything more specific I can advise on, I can try my best, but don't be afraid to do what's right for you, because at the end of the day, health and well-being comes before anything else. Hang on, I'm going to have a glug of water. I'm going to take care of myself. How does one advocate for their disability in the workplace when you're in a place that doesn't have a disability-friendly team? I'm not sure I should be bringing it up with my employer. I'm really sorry to hear that. Advocacy is something that takes time and practice. I know what it's like when you've been somewhere for a while and you feel like, well, I haven't spoken up before, so how can I possibly do it now? I think it also depends on your preferred communication styles, but if you're not sure how it's going to go down if you're speaking to somebody in person, face to face, you could put it into an email. You could look, if it's a big organization, if they have any sort of like well-being support, any well-being groups, peer groups support. And if there isn't something that's disability specific or that resonates for you, it might even be that the way to ask for it is emailing somebody in charge and saying, I wondered if you've considered setting up a disability group. That might be one way around it without you personally having to identify yourself as somebody who requires that, if that's something you're uncomfortable with. That's one way around it, but I'm personally not the most assertive person in the world. If you are really struggling, please don't hesitate to actually go to somebody and say, hey, I need some help. As a person living in York with a chronic illness, I found it hard to find any community, with most disability groups being more visible disability focused. Right, I've got two great resources for you here. First of all, I'm really sorry to hear that. If by any chance you have ME, there is a Facebook group called York ME Community. It's run by somebody called Bill, and although I'm not really an active participant in there, I always see their posts popping up on Facebook, and I always think, what a lovely community. People really go out of their way to help each other, whether that's practical help, emotional help, just to have a chat. They have little meetups, they have Zoom natters. And there's also, I'm going to get the name of this wrong, there's something new that's popped up. I think it's called Cafe Neuro York. And again, I don't think they gatekeep what sort of conditions that members can have, but it's in Huntington, I think. And they are starting to put on regular events and stuff like that. And then the other thing I've just focused on, I need to be keeping an eye on time. The other thing I've just thought of is, if you are really struggling with isolation, if you go to your GP, it might be that social prescribing is something that can help you. Social prescribing is basically where you get a link worker and they can sit down and talk with you about what you're looking for and what your hobbies are and what sort of thing you're interested in. And then they are the most knowledgeable people who can connect you with local services and resources. So social prescribing is something to bear in mind as well. Access to work, no support available to help you locate or order the equipment needed, and it's difficult to know when companies don't respond or send invoices. Yes. And you're thinking about buying up front and getting them reimbursed from DWP. Yes, you're 100% right. My best advice with access to work is to find an advocate. Even if you've already started that process like you have, there are advocates available online. Some of them you pay for, some of them are free. I'll give you the name of who I use, but I know they've got a massive waiting list. I use an organisation called Accessibility Partners. And sometimes just in having an advocate who knows the system and knows how to play the game can really be the thing that gives you that clarity and helps to move things forward. But yeah, you have my empathy with that one. There is so much paperwork for access to work. Yeah, it's not a perfect system at all. Thank you very much for the kind words as well that are coming in the question box. I really appreciate it. This is kind of a related one. Even before I was chronically ill, I found the admin side of being a freelancer exhausting. Do you have any specific strategies for reducing the exertion of freelancer admin? Again, that's something I'm actively working on, but the person who asked about a job aid earlier, that's one of the ways that I utilise my job aid. If there are complex contracts that need breaking down, sometimes you'll get pages and pages of documents for a simple task. So just having somebody to whittle down that information can be really helpful. So consider whether a job aid or a support worker would be valuable for you. Reducing the exertion of freelancer admin. You might want to look at tools like Calendly, anything that just reduces the back and forth of emails. So having things like Calendly mean that you can send a link and people can book a meeting in with you at a time when you're free, rather than having the back and forth while you try and compare diaries and find something that works for you both. Might come back to that one actually, because I feel like there will be other stuff, but it is something I'm actively working on at the minute as well. There will be a recording of this session, which you can share with employers. It will be on York St John Events YouTube channel. Thank you very much for sharing. I really appreciate it. Any resources online about getting through the day with an energy limiting condition, more info about pacing? If there aren't yet, I feel like they're coming. Chronic Illness Inclusion has a website and they have a lot of research papers and a lot of research summaries about energy limiting conditions. Pacing, I've only seen this online, I haven't read it yet, but there's a girl called Amy Arthur and she's got a book coming out about pacing, I think next year. I can't remember the title of it and I haven't read it myself, but it sounds like it's going to be great. So her name is Amy Arthur. I believe it's her debut book, and that is hopefully going to shed it's based on her experiences of pacing and the science behind it. So I feel like that's going to be a really useful read. Could dyslexia and ADHD be treated as a disability with similar work adjustments as chronic illness? Absolutely. I can't talk from lived experience because I don't have either of those things, but from what I can gather, well, they definitely will qualify as disabilities. You are allowed to identify as a disabled person, I should say. And I do hear on the grapevine that a lot of the adjustments that I talk about would also be beneficial for people who are neurodivergent as well. So yes, absolutely. What is your advice about getting employers to agree to blended working to help me with a condition that is worsening when they insist they need me on site every day? They are trying to get me to move to part-time working, but I cannot afford to do this. Yeah, that's really tough. If you have employers who aren't willing to budge, I don't personally agree with this, but sometimes you have to kind of put like a capitalist spin on things. It's all about thinking how you can make it sound as though you are doing them a favor. So in your case, it sounds like you're working in a physical environment every day and you want to be able to work from home some of the time. So maybe it's about posing the question as, if I continue having to come in every day, I'm not going to be able to do my job as well or as efficiently as I would be able to when if I was working from home. So if I do that, it's going to be of detriment to the company and my standard of working. I don't need to go part-time. I can still offer you all the value that I've offered you before, but this is an adjustment I need to make sure that you are really getting the best out of me as an employee. Try phrasing it that way and see if that makes any difference. And if not, send them Astriid's details and we'll do a bit of disability awareness training with them. Somebody has shared, for the person who spoke about stopping work, speak to an employer about an unpaid career break so your position is kept for you. Yeah, that's really worth considering as well. Okay, there's a lot of questions in this one. Did you experience any exclusion with remote learning? I didn't do remote learning. So I was at uni 2013 to 2016 and I did in person. Technically, I did in person, but I taught myself most of the degree from home. But that was very unofficial. That wasn't an official adjustment at that time. Assessment of needs is undertaken by unqualified, unregulated, and non-medical practitioners. Do you consider this to be acceptable? Absolutely not, no. I had to outline my personal medical circumstances to 3 lay people, none of whom referred to my GP. I felt as though I was labelled disabled and the support offered was neither tailored to my needs nor considered the emotional impact of disclosing sensitive info. What was your experience? Disclosing in work. So my experience is always going to be a little bit different because a lot of my portfolio and a lot of the work I'm known for is all online. So people often know about my health situation before approaching me for work, which I realise there are certain privileges that come with that. So it's very rarely the case that I do have to disclose my disability to somebody new in a work context because I'm blabbing about it all over the internet anyway. What advice can I offer there? Yeah, just disclose whatever you feel comfortable disclosing. You don't have to share any more than what you're comfortable with. I totally get what you're saying, that the impact of sharing can take a toll emotionally as well. So I think it's about figuring out what exactly you're comfortable sharing and what you want to keep for yourself at that moment in time. You don't have to give somebody the full story right at the very beginning. I think that's what I'm trying to say. I often find that people don't ever really understand the nuance of my chronic illness, which is why I use the term energy limiting condition. I generally say I'm a disabled person and this is the way I work, as opposed to trying to make people understand something that can be very difficult to understand. Still okay for time? Yep, we're good. Thank you for all these questions. They're great. I'm planning on starting uni in September and wondered what your top tip would be for managing. I've ordered your book in the hopes of some support with the anxiety that comes with going to uni. Thank you for ordering my book. If there's anybody here who thinks it might be helpful, I have a book called University and Chronic Illness, a Survival Guide. That's available on my website. And that's essentially everything I wish I'd had somebody to tell me about going to uni with a chronic illness. So I really hope that book comes in helpful for you. I think my top tip for managing, if I had to pick just one, I think it's not to be afraid of spending energy on the overall uni experience rather than just the aspect of studying and the academic side of it. Because uni is about so much more than just the learning and just the course. And sometimes I remember feeling quite guilty for spending time with friends when I was thinking, well, maybe I should be studying instead. And obviously, studying is really important, and you want to make sure you're there for what you're there to do. But if possible, don't compromise on the social side, the other great opportunities that uni brings into your life, and don't isolate yourself from the people around you. I went through a stage where I thought it would be less painful to isolate myself from other people because I felt like I couldn't relate. But I think just understanding that not everybody is going to understand what you're going through, but that doesn't have to dictate whether or not you can be friends with them. So I suppose my top tip is just to immerse yourself as much as you can or as much as you want to, and don't worry about spending energy on you and taking care of your mental well-being as well. Okay, there's a question about disabled drivers trying to park in York. I don't feel qualified to answer that question. I think that's a little bit out of my remit today, so I'm going to leave that one for now, but it's a very topical issue at the minute, and I was really pleased to see the reverse the ban success, the fact that they're going back on that policy now. Sharing your story online as a way to get back into work and develop an online portfolio, advice with regards to finding that balance with sharing. DWP, I've heard, have a history of checking up on social media accounts and have a history of not understanding. I'm thinking about that stage where you demonstrate your capabilities to gain opportunities, but not well enough to come off benefits. This is something that's holding me back from making progress. Yeah, it's really, really good that you're mindful of that. It's really sad that you have to be mindful of that. Again, I will disclose I am not entitled to anything apart from access to work, so it's not something that I have to take into account. But I'm probably not the best person to advise with that one. I think just being mindful of it as you are. That's really tricky. I think there are always ways to share your story. And if it is something that you're worried about, don't be afraid of really leaning into the difficulties of what you're experiencing, because all of those things are incredibly true. I sometimes worry that what I'm putting out online paints a picture that I'm better than I am. But I think if you lean more into the side where you're talking about the very real difficulties you face, that even if you do find yourself in a situation where people are looking at your social media, they will find a story that correlates with your benefits application as well. It's just so sad that people have to be mindful. I'm so sorry. It's just an awful situation, and I'm really sorry I don't have better advice. But it's really good that you're being mindful of it, and I wish you all the best with your online portfolio. I hope that you have a really great experience with it. Convincing employers to allow hybrid working. This person would add occupational health should be allowed too. Hopefully occupational health will advocate. Yeah, that's another great resource to be aware of. How can I get doctors to take me seriously? I'm so sorry. Depends where you're based. If you're based in York, if you're based anywhere, you are always entitled to a second opinion. Sometimes it can take quite a lot of trial and error to find a GP that really listens to you, but when you find them, they are so worth having. There used to be a really great service called Yorkshire Fatigue Clinic that has now changed into something else, and I can't comment on what the new service is like, but it might be worth asking if you can be referred to a fatigue clinic, because often the people there have a more comprehensive understanding of fatigue than GPs might have. I am going to start skimming through these because I'm quite conscious of time. I really hope if you can see the chat, I really hope you can see the comments that people are leaving, because a lot of people are sharing advice that would be really useful for other people. So thank you so much if you shared resources that might be helpful for others. I really appreciate that. Oh, yes. If you're starting uni, apply for DSA, apply for Disabled Students Allowance. How did I forget that? It's obviously all detailed in my book. But again, if you have a chronic illness, you are entitled to Disabled Students Allowance, and that works in a similar way to access to work. It can help you to fund the things you need to have a great experience. Is the talk you did yesterday also available online? Yes, that will be available on my YouTube channel. I did a talk yesterday about sharing your disability story online. My YouTube channel is under Pippa Stacey, and that should be up there this week, hopefully. There's another one about parking that I'm just not equipped to answer. I don't have experience in that area. But if you want to see things about this, York Disability Week is always open to pitches for events. So it might be that next year's event, maybe let them know that that's something that you want to see on their programme. What can you do if an employer ignores the occupational health report and refuse all reasonable adjustments? That's not good. I'm so sorry you're going through that. If you work for a big organisation, I think it's time to contact HR. If not, it might be time to send a polite reply to your employer just saying, I'm just checking you received the report. I wonder what the next steps are for implementing these adjustments. Just phrasing it in a way that leaves no room for ambiguity. Chat is disabled. Oh, so none of you can see the questions that are being right. Okay, I'm with you. I've got it. Okay, let me have a quick skim up and share anything that people might find helpful. Somebody said PIP is a really useful resource. Again, it's really hard to apply for, but if you can get it, that's great because it can help you to cover the extra costs. Yeah, we said the one about if you're having to stop work, perhaps speak to an employer about an unpaid career break. I'm sure I saw some other bits and bobs about. Maybe I did get them all. Yeah, maybe I did get them all. We've got 2 more minutes if there are any last questions that people want to ask. I'm sorry that you can't see that stuff for yourself. I will have a look after the session. And if there's anything that I feel is worth pulling up, I will try and share that somewhere. Yes, York Disability Rights Forum are very helpful. They're another great organisation and they're very much, what's the phrase? They're person-led. They're led by people with lived experience. So if you're looking for community or you're looking for extra support for things that are local, York Disability Rights Forum is great. And I know you can't see the Q&A, but I just want to say thank you so much to those of you who are sending really kind words. I really appreciate it. I'm really glad this has been helpful. This is what I was looking for. Thank you to the person who has just resent this comment. So this person says, I want to encourage the person who said they might have to leave work. I was recently forced to leave a journalism job I did for 13 years due to a worsening chronic illness. It's been hard, but I'm now using some of that time to pursue writing I've always wanted to do, such as poetry and fiction. Currently, I'm collecting disability and living off savings, but I'm taking the opportunity to focus on things that I find more fulfilling with the hope that the money will eventually come. So sometimes when one door closes, another can open. Thank you for sharing that. I think that's just a really great way to look at everything chronic illness. It can be so hard to plan for the future. Often we have to make sacrifices that in a truly accessible world we wouldn't have to make, but all we can do is try and make the best of what we have and turn our thoughts to the future instead. I really think, I always say prepare for the worst and hope for the best is the best way to do things. And that brings us nicely to the end of this session. So thank you very much again for being here. I know that your time and energy are really valuable, so I'm really grateful that you spent some with me this evening. I hope there's been something you can take away from this. And as I say, this will be up on York St John Events YouTube channel in a few days. If you're online, my blog is at lifeofpippa.co.uk. I'm on social media at Life of Pippa on most platforms. And we will leave that here for now. Thank you very much again for your kind words. Thanks, everyone. Have a great evening. Bye.